My name is Michael G. Williams. I'm going to be reading to you from my novel, A Fallen Autumn, which is a far future science fiction noir story. I wanted to take the idea of a hard-boiled detective and put that into a science fiction setting. This setting is many thousands of years into humanity's future when humanity's sort of crowning technological achievement is genetic engineering, and that is the apex of their technology. The term humanity is applied pretty broadly in that future. 20 or 25% of the population are people who have either been genetically designed from the ground up, or they've received some pretty significant enhancements to their sort of baseline designed genome. And those people are often referred to as human plus, or they're referred to as upgrades. Sometimes they're derogatorily referred to as floor models. Then 75 or 80% of the population are referred to somewhat derogatorily as mannies. They are human-animal hybrids. They're actually uplifted animals. And legally, they're considered people, but they often are on the receiving end of some pretty bad discrimination. They don't have a lot of economic access. They don't have a lot of political access, things like that. And then there's this very thin slice between them in the social order of about 0.1% of the population who are called artisanal humans. Those, in the words of the narrator of this novel and his sort of more jaundiced view, are people whose parents were too dumb to know better and made them the old-fashioned way. Artisanal humans are isolated from the rest of the population. They're kept away from a lot of technology, and they're encouraged to live on the reservations where they tend to grow up, in part because they are society's backup copy of the human genome. If genetic engineering takes things too far, then you've got 100,000 or so arties around whose genome at least is unmodified and can be used to get back anything that has been stretched too thin in the human genome. The hero in this story is an arty. He's an artisanal human. He escaped from the reservation as a teenager, and now he lives on this in the last of the great flying cities, Autumn, which is sort of the cultural hub of his society. He spent a while as a street hustler, then he worked his way up to a low-rent private eye, and now, afflicted with a terminal illness, he is working what he expects is going to be his last case. Because of the political and social standing of artisanal humans and the way that medicine works in that culture, he does not have access to a lot in the way of healthcare because it would involve genetic modification, and he is not allowed to have that. His client is a golem. Golems are not exactly mythical, but they're very rare, and we would call them androids. And our hero has a very suspicious view of golems because they're designed and they're engineered, and he doesn't trust the idea of someone who has been designed to make him like them. But now I'm going to dive into the actual reading. I settled down on my branch, the weight of my failing body suddenly greater than I remembered it being on the hike up. Exhaustion tied itself to all my corners and sank. Exhaustion from the night spent drinking, from my liver working overtime to deal with that booze, from my walk across the city's landscape, from too little sleep gotten on a lumpy couch in a cold office I could no longer afford. The pink edge of the sky turned red and then yellow, and just as a tiny crescent of the sun himself started to crest over the four barrier and golden spotlights shot westward between the buildings of my beautiful city, I heard rustling from below as someone approached quietly but not stealthily, the footfalls of a person who didn't want to disturb their own reverie by stomping around. It was Alejandro walking into the clearing at the climax of the trail, and he was turning to face the sunrise and closing his eyes as the rays struck him all at once. I stayed where I was, quiet as I could be, my gaze shifting back and forth between the absurdly beautiful light show on the horizon and that same light playing across Alejandro's simultaneously too smooth and too human features. Do you often come here in the morning? His voice was quiet, but it carried, and anyway, he didn't exactly have a lot of competition to be heard. Alejandro turned to face me, or at least in my direction, despite me thinking I was hidden. I do, he went on. I come here to watch the sunrise at least once a week. It, walked closer to me. He didn't seem to know exactly where I was, though it occurred to me he was just pretending in order to be polite. I couldn't stand the thought of that. Couldn't stand the thought of being pandered to by a machine designed to make me like him in the first place. So I half jumped and half tumbled right out of the tree and onto the ground, the alcohol cushioning me for the moment against the worst of the pain of impact. I could tell when I landed, I was a little thinner in the bones than 6 months before. It was the first time I felt frail. I love to come here, I said from where I lay, still crumpled awkwardly on the ground, my coat twisted up around me and my hat fallen to the side. And I love to come here. I rolled over onto my side and then up onto one leg, then another, standing unsteadily and half-heartedly dusting myself off. I hoped to bother him with that. I wanted to offend the delicate sensibilities I associated with these timeless, semi-legendary creatures of metal and soft eyes and room temperature false flesh. Alejandro walked over to just outside of arm's reach and looked at me with those eyes narrowed in sympathy, a surplus of forgiveness for whatever dumb idea resulted in me being here at the literal crack of dawn. "You're dying, aren't you?" he said. I blinked. How did everyone know? Did the Church of the Infinite Upward Spiral of the Double Helix tattoo it onto my forehead? "We get used to noticing things," he said in response to my frown. "Golems, I mean. We spend enough time around people to detect patterns." He tried to look a little self-conscious about it and almost succeeded. I figured he did the best he could with the false facial musculature his designers gave him. "I'm sorry." "I'm dying," I said. "Apologies are a waste of time." "So is anger," Alejandro countered. "No, it isn't," I said. "Sometimes anger is the closest thing I can find to a reason to live. There are mornings when the only thing getting me out of bed is the desire to piss someone off." "What about other days? What gets you out of bed when you aren't angry?" He looked sad, like he'd heard these sorts of antics before, and maybe he had. Maybe he'd been around since before the ancients popped their big balloon. Maybe he'd had 100,000 humans tell him all about how sad they were. I hated them too. The same thing getting anyone else out of bed. The rent, a cup of coffee, and the hope I'll maybe get laid if I'm lucky. I sure as shit don't do it for the home-cooked meals, do I? That was when he kissed me, and I kissed him, and the two of us did something halfway between fucking and making love right there in the middle of Down Preserves, while the sun came up on autumn and a virtuously busy morning wound its springs without us. The sun was over the trees at the southeastern edge of the sloped opening in the forest when I awoke. It was the sun that woke me, actually, its rays on my face, the flicker of shadow and light as it played across my closed eyes. I was half dressed, but my shoes were off, my feet bare, and my coat was spread over me in lieu of a blanket. My shirt was somewhere, probably. I wasn't wearing it anyway, and my eyes weren't open yet, but I could feel it was nearby the way you can sense an old dog by your chair or a former lover on the opposite side of an otherwise perfectly nice party. My back was curled against something firm and supporting, and I felt gentle fingers stroke the tufts of silvery black at my temples. "Hematite," a man told me once. I would always love him a little for saying that. My hair there wasn't yet gray, but no longer black, and when it was wet, it looked like hematite. And he said it like that meant something deep and significant and mystical I would never understand. Having someone's fingers run through it felt good, though. It felt like a happy memory, like something I didn't expect would happen much anymore if it ever really happened in the first place. That simple touch was a comfort to me. It's the most minor thing, and for that reason, the most missed when it's gone. I don't go long stretches without being touched, but it had been a while between caresses. This was that, a caress and more. Not exactly sexual, but not exactly platonic. It was that happy in between we call intimate. I made myself vulnerable to other men, and they themselves to me, more times than I can count in my too short life. It didn't always work out, though, that my usual flavor of street trade would show basic human kindness in return for mine. None of that mattered, though. Those guys were long gone. Right that second, someone was running his fingers through my half-asleep hair, and it was intimate, and they were kind. I was vulnerable, and that was okay. For a few moments, I wasn't dying, and I wasn't scared. I wasn't lonely, and I wasn't alone. The sun felt good, and the breeze through the branches was the sound of Gaia herself telling me to go back to sleep. And I thought for a moment I might be okay with dying fairly soon if I got to wake up like this every morning for the rest of my life. Okay, I said. I didn't move and I didn't open my eyes because I wasn't quite ready for the moment to go away, even as I lifted the pin to pop its balloon. You want something, so tell me what it is, because if I say yes, I may not have much time to hold up my end of the bargain. Thanks.
Hi, y'all. I am Rory niCoileain, and I'm from Minneapolis. And I, by way of a 5-year sabbatical in New York City. And my currently in print work at the moment is a 9-book series called Soul Shares. I like to describe it as a gateway drug to urban fantasy for fans of gay erotic romance and a gateway drug to gay erotic romance for fans of urban fantasy. And I'm going to do a reading from the last book in the series, Backdoor into Purgatory. Hopefully you see behind me and it's hopefully facing the right way. And I'm not going to dump 9 books worth of explanation on you. This particular scene that I have chosen to read involves Mac, a Vietnam vet who lost his right leg to a jumper mine in 1974. His husband, Lucien, a French-Canadian bouncer with shoulders about as wide as he is tall, and their husband, Rowan, a demisexual fae who can shapeshift into a merfae or a seal or a salmon. And they are all presently, at this point in the story, involved in with all the other fae and the humans and one Gilladouv, which is a Scottish tree symbiote, I guess is a good way to put it, and a flatulent fadehound puppy, in plans to kill the Marfok, which is a supernatural evil that has been spending the last 8.5 books trying to destroy both the Fae and human worlds. It's beautiful. What was beautiful, in Lucien's opinion, was the light in his Fae husband's eyes as he studied the huge tank built into one wall of what was going to be the new Purgatory dance floor. Other clubs had cages for dancers. One the 3 of them had found in New York had glass-walled shower stalls. Purgatory was going to have the biggest Maudite fish tank anyone had ever seen, complete with naked mermen, one of whom, because Le Bon Dieu apparently had a perverse sense of humor, was going to be Lucien de Winter. Arms went around Lucien from behind, and a chin rested on his shoulder. Lucien didn't need to turn or even to look down and see the Semper Fi tattooed on one forearm to recognize Mac. Ready to take the plunge, Fuzzball? Lucien grunted. I hope the filters in this thing are up to spec. You know how I shed. A flash of white reflected in the glass of the tank was Rowan's grin. Perhaps we should put a tail on you. If the tail didn't have hair, no one would believe it was mine. Lucien couldn't stay grumpy, though, not when Rowan teased him. But I think the 2 of you, not to mention our boss, are out of your minds if you think our guests are going to be turned on watching me doing underwater barrel rolls. Rowan left off studying the tank fittings and took Lucien's hands, running his thumbs lightly over knuckles dusted with short, dark, curly hair. His slight worried frown was one of the sweetest things Lucien had ever seen. How could they not be, La Rode Erfuz? Lucien found himself having to swallow an unexpected lump in his throat before he could answer. I love you too. Mac leaned around and kissed the side of Lucien's neck. He beat me to it. And I'm not even going to tell you how many guys used to come up to the bar and ask me why the bouncer wasn't part of the floor show. Lucien craned his neck, partly to plant a kiss of his own on Mac and partly to glance at the new bar, the one the workmen had just finished installing last week to replace the one Mac had presided over ever since Tiernan bought the place. The curved expanse, now taking up the whole back wall of one level of the club instead of being shoehorned into a corner, looked pretty much the same as it always had from where Lucien stood. But no one had been able to figure out how to replicate the show-stopping feature of the original, the hellish flames dancing under the glass bar top that seemed to go down and down into an infinite depth. Connell thought he might be able to do it with magic, or maybe Rian could. But nobody wanted to fuck around with magic of any kind near the Great Nexus, not with the way it and its companion Wellspring were acting right now. Good thing he and his husbands had decided to try out the famed Nexus chamber when they had. A half-royal fae in the throes of erotic overload was the kind of thing guaranteed to short out the entire Wellspring network right now. The fact that their newfound underground garden of delights was now off limits seriously pissed Lucienne off. It wasn't forever, though. The three of them could get back to happy business just as soon as they figured out how to kill the monster who had left him for dead behind that bar back in August. Can't happen soon enough for me. Lucienne was a peaceable sort. As peaceable as a nightclub bouncer built like a hairy fire hydrant and married to an only sort of ex-Marine could be anyway. But he was looking forward to getting his hands around whatever was left of Yannick O'Halloran's throat and getting creative. I recognize that look. Mac nipped at the top of Lucienne's ear. What look? Lucienne blinked. And I could have sworn you're standing behind me. You reflect in the tank. Mac's chuckle rumbled against Lucienne's back. At least for now. Once you've been for a swim after we open, the glass is going to have palm prints all over it. Lucienne couldn't help snorting. I repeat, what look? Rowan wrapped his arms around both humans. He could do that. Mac was a good head taller than Lucienne, but their fae had Mac beat by a good 4 or 5 inches, and he had arms to match his height. The look you wore through most of the Basiguinia last night. The Fayen words Rowan had originally translated for them as war council turned out to have meant something closer to forememory of death. The intent of the Domain of Purgatory had been, more or less, to create the memory of the Marfok's death before it happened. And like pretty much everything asking Faye to behave in an organized manner, it had gone south from the moment Rian tried calling the group to order. It hadn't helped that Faye, who learned English magically, thought the word brainstorming was almost as funny as horseradish, which was actually pretty damn funny once Maildwin had explained it to him. There had been some great opportunities for glowering, though. Lucienne supposed that was the look his husbands were on about. I didn't notice either one of you looking disappointed at the thought of killing the Depedimard, he grumbled. Hell no. Lucienne thought he could feel Mac's jaw clench where his husband's chin rested on top of his head. But I'd feel a lot better right now if anyone had any useful ideas. It helps to know that it fears water. There was a smile in Rowan's voice, one very different from his usual sexy innocence. I should be able to do something with that. It hadn't been all that long ago that Lucienne had been terrified of water and trapped in a fuck ton of it, reliving at not quite random memories with the Marfok on his ass. It was bizarre beyond belief that he was now sharing a soul with a part-time merman and getting ready to perform as one himself. And that wasn't even close to being the strangest thing that had happened to him since August. Just between you, me, Fuzzball, and the 4 walls, I think water may be the best chance we have. Rowan tilted his head, thinking. When he did that, his crest of blonde hair always made Lucienne think of a cockatoo. How does having water between us and the walls help? Matt groaned good-naturedly and smacked Rowan's ass. Oh, I am being too literal-minded again. Rowan rested his chin on the side of Lucienne's head Mac wasn't occupying. Lucienne was beginning to feel squashed. Squash between his husbands was one of his favorite feelings, though. Don't ever change. The kiss happened somewhere where Lucienne couldn't see it. Seriously, though, I don't think our mages and our blade dancers have thought this one through. They're still thinking in terms of taking on the Marfok here, on this side of the pattern. Lucienne held back a groan of his own. That particular argument had gone on nearly till sunrise, and parts of it had probably continued past them. Neither Kevin nor Terry had been happy with their respective partners' bloody-minded enthusiasm for the idea of taking turns vivisecting the monster, and while Josh had mostly looked resigned to what the Royal Mage and the Lore Master had concocted, their prince had obviously been saving a few choice words for Quinn. Still, it's not like we have much of a choice. We can't even get a skinny whisper through the Nexus. We sure as hell aren't going to be able to fit a 6'6" zombie through it. He could feel Mac shaking his head. Sometimes the ground dictates your tactics, but sometimes you can't afford to let it. Lucienne shrugged, mostly because he liked the way it felt. You're the soldier, but I don't think you're going to get Tiernan and Maildwin to listen to you. Or me, he nearly added. But that wouldn't help anything. And even Lucien knew that it was ridiculous for him to think he had a chance, one-on-one against the Marfok. His protective instincts, the gift of his fey soul, he'd been told, didn't give a shit about his chances, though. He just wanted to take the Tabarnak de Calice down. I know. Mac's sigh stirred the curly hairs on the side of Lucien's neck. But if we can herd the Marfok through the Nexus without having to get close enough for it to get at any of us, nobody has to risk getting killed, or worse. Or worse, being one of those ideas that would have been impossible for Lucien to get his head around before August. Not anymore, though. And he would be fucked with a chainsaw before he let or worse happen to either of his husbands. The monster had caught him flat-footed once before. It wasn't going to do it again. A kiss on the top of his head startled Lucien. He looked up into cut topaz eyes and a gentle smile. My Larode Erfuz is troubled. Lucien rested his head against Rowan's chest. He was still getting used to the idea of letting somebody else be the strong one. He'd been tight with a Marine since the mid-70s, but he'd had to hold that Marine up through some incredibly shitty times, and having someone else doing the same thing for him was still new. Your fuzzball just wants to put an end to that shitbag and probably can't. It didn't surprise him that Rowan had known where his head was at. He and Mac had always seemed to have that knack with each other, and when the third part of their shared soul had arrived from the realm, he'd slipped right into that communion like he'd always been there. And Rowan wasn't the only one who could head hop. Clear as day, Lucien could sense the pull the huge water tank behind them had on his fey husband. How long has it been since you've been able to sleep in water? Are we counting the time in the bathtub? Mac nearly choked, and Lucien only just managed to turn a guffaw into a cough. That was just maybe the worst idea any of us ever had. Watching Rowan trying to curl up in the tub in their apartment had been like, well, watching John Cleese trying to get comfortable on top of a coffee table. No, we're not counting the time in the bathtub. Nearly 2 weeks then, Rowan grimaced, since the well springs became unstable, including the one under the pool. Mac rested his hands on Rowan's shoulders. That's not good. Rowan laughed softly. Neither is what happens to our wellspring when the three of us are together there, and I have no wish to sleep alone. You don't have to. Lucien twisted around to look down into the cockpit. The black leather playground, famed in song and story, was going to be reborn in the new purgatory. Only this time, its protection from DC's finest was going to rely less on Lucien's sixth sense and Fiachra's truth sight, and more on a state-of-the-art lockdown system. And the furniture had just been delivered yesterday morning. Mac, do you think the two of us can fit on one of those sofas? You, me, and half the cast of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. It took the two of them, three once Rowan caught on to what they were doing, a few minutes, but eventually they hauled one of the sofas up the few steps separating the pit from the rest of the club and positioned it next to the tank. Of course, the only working light switch was all the way over on the other side of the Maudita room. By the time Lucien found it and killed the lights, Mac had skinned out of his trousers and was mostly finished removing his leg, working by the light of his cell phone. Rowan was, of course, watching, fascinated from inside the tank. Faye had never developed much in the way of technology, hadn't needed to, and Rowan had thought Mac's sea leg was magical at first. But then the half-royal Faye had thought Mac was magical too. That makes two of us.
So the first question in the Q&A looks like it's from Scott, and he was asking about the title for A Fallen Autumn. The setting is one in which humankind is sort of on the decline towards another dark age. There's been some intervening period of time between our time and the time of the story when humanity achieved a lot of like machine technology, and they built, you know, a bunch of flying cities and did all these really amazing things. And now nobody really understands how the flying cities worked, and they're a bunch of the story is set in the last of the flying cities. All the others have crashed, all the others are gone. Everybody sort of assumes that one day autumn will fall out of the sky also. But I also wanted to, originally I knew all of that concept, but I didn't know the name of the city. And I wanted a name for the city that would sort of suggest that it's a beautiful thing that is also in decay. And so autumn eventually presented itself as the name of the city because autumn is beautiful, but also all the trees are dropping their leaves and all those leaves are dead. And then I wanted to also reflect that noir idea of beyond the hard-boiled detective story where it's hard to succeed, the more noirish concept of like maybe there is no such thing as a happy ending. At the very least, Valerius, the main character, has stopped believing in the possibility of happy endings. And so I liked A Fall in Autumn because it was kind of the play in words, but it's also Valerius sort of falling from what he had hoped would be a lifetime of sort of like moving up in the world. And Trevor, in answer to your question, yes, Asimov is very much an inspiration. I love me some robot books.
So I think the second question was from Scott asking about the slow burn in the story. And I wasn't actually sure if he was referring to the fact that they're kind of tripping each other up in that scene and kind of burning each other in a sarcastic way, or if you're talking about the slow burn of the romance. I'm going to go with the latter on that one. I really love exploring what attracts people to each other and how people who are very, very, very different and don't seem like they could possibly work find something that draws them, you know, an almost psychic something that draws them to one another despite differences, despite different views and different professions and different status. So it's definitely something that I use a lot in most of my work. And yes, it continues throughout the book.
And Scott put down a question for me. Rory, do you recommend signing multiple book long-term contracts? Scott knows me. When I first started writing, I was scared to death that I was going to publish the first book in a series and then nobody would want the rest of them. And when I was offered basically an open-ended contract by my first publisher, I signed a contract for the first 4 books, and then partway through those first 4 books, my characters informed me that I needed 4 more. So yeah, I ended up with a contract for 8 books, and then the last book I did without a contract, which I also don't recommend, but that's another story. But yeah, if I ever sign an 8-book contract with anybody else ever again, somebody please put me out of my misery, because that was one of the dumbest things I think I ever did. I thought it was security at the time, but oh dear Lord.
Yeah, my first contract was for 3 books, and that was a challenge. Just as 3, I can't even imagine what that would have been like.
And part of the problem was, of course, that November 2016 happened right in the middle of the whole thing. And my muse kind of told me to F off and went and sat in a corner. So, yeah, it was not fun.
Yeah, my publisher, Falstaff Books, has sort of an unwritten rule that they don't publish standalones. But I pitched A Fall in Autumn as a standalone novel, and they took it and then said, is there any way that there could be more than 1 book in this? And I said, oh yeah, there can be 4 more as long as I can jump around in Valerius's lifespan and tell different stories about this character from different points in his life. And it doesn't have to be one continuous story, because I feel like that would help me not get bored with the character. And they said, no problem, here's a contract, give us 4 more autumn books. And so the second autumn book, called New Life in Autumn, comes out in October.
So Scott's asking, what we are all working on now. He says, Elle, yours was from a work in progress, so what's next on your list? Trying to sell this, and I've got the 3rd book in the trilogy coming out in October. First 2 of which are already out, but that's science fiction romance, and this is urban fantasy romance. So nothing specific that I'm currently working on. What about you guys?
Go ahead, Rory.
I'm incubating a couple of things. Right now, I think what I'm mostly doing is trying to figure out where I go next. I have a fairly well plotted out science fiction story. It will be probably a standalone, although it might be 2 books. I don't know. I have a very bad grasp of how long stories actually end up being when I start plotting. But the 3 main characters are an elderly librarian with stabby knitting needles who goes on a quest to save the world, and an alien from, I can't really call her an alien. She is from the world that takes up most of, pretty much all of the book, actually. She comes from the world that the elderly librarian crash lands on. And an agender artificial intelligence. And they are a very sort of a strange poly relationship. But that's not so much the focus of the story as other things. But I'm also, right now I'm studying to become a spiritual director. And my home church is Episcopalian. And I'm feeling pulled to do some writing along those lines too. So I don't know. And of course, my muse is still having a hissy fit. It's hard for me to write at all right now. I don't know if either of you two are having the same problem, but it's like pulling teeth.
To some degree, yeah, I definitely am experiencing that. My current work in progress is 3rd installment in a 4 novella series that starts with Through the Doors of Oblivion, which is a time travel urban fantasy series set in San Francisco, starring some queer witches who live in the Tenderloin and the spirit of Emperor Norton, a real historical eccentric from San Francisco, whom they've sort of summoned back to the land of the living. And it has been very difficult to write at the moment for most of the current debacle, by which I mean since November 2016. I've actually written a lot because that has been an escape. And then in the last 4 or 5 months, that's been like really difficult. But that's what I'm working on right now, and I'm really excited about it. And I think that once I finish that series, that I'll feel like the creative juices are flowing again. The next question was, I'd like to ask all the authors, who are your literary or other inspirations? For example, Michael, any others besides Asimov? Oh, wow, the list is lengthy. So I'll name a couple that I really love. I really love Anne Rice because her novels are almost always driven by the relationships between the characters. It's not necessarily a question of like, you know, the MacGuffin. It's, you know, characters and their relationships driving the events forward. And I always really love that. And I try to reflect that. A lot of my books are about what happens when people who know each other want different things. Also Terry Pratchett, partly because I like to have sort of a sense of humor to the weirder, darker, grosser parts of some of what I write. I describe my horror as not being necessarily horror so much as wry horror, because it's horror that remembers that it can have a sense of humor. So with Perishables, the first book in the Withrow Chronicles, a vampire urban fantasy series I wrote, a reviewer described it as Stephen Colbert meets Stephen King, because and I wrote to them and said, I don't know you, but I appreciate that, and I'm going to have that put on everything that I publish for the rest of my life, up to and including my tombstone, because I like horror stories that remember that it can be a little funny when somebody's head gets ripped off. And so, you know, there are a lot of things like that. But Terry Pratchett also, because he has a really big, complicated world and tells stories of like converging events. And I really like stories about converging events. And I'll stop talking now.
Influences, too many to name. Anne McCaffrey, obviously an early influence. Elizabeth Moon, Tanya Huff, J.A. Pitts, who cracked the big 5 publishers with a lesbian urban fantasy romance series, which was fantastic. If you haven't read the Black Blade Blues series, it's wonderful. Jenny Frame, M.B. Austin, there are so many. It's impossible for me to narrow that down.
Yeah, the list is just too long. Ursula Le Guin, Jane Leolin, Diane Duane, P.C. Hodgel, Eleanor Arneson. P.C. Hodgel was actually my mentor in college. She was my major advisor. And if you haven't read her Titastigon books, get them. They're fabulous. I could go on for like ever. Sherry Tepper.
Mm-hmm. Also, Susanna asked if this is okay. Do any or all of you make a living from your books? If you have a day job, how does that interact with your writing in terms of time and energy, etc.? There have been years where I reported a profit, but I do not make a living from being a writer. I have a day job in computer security in higher education. I really love my day job, and it is mentally taxing, and so I get to write on Saturdays.
Yeah, I also have a day job. I'm a middle school writing teacher by day. And I'm really fairly new to this. I got my first contract in 2015 and my second one last year. So I'm just getting started. I hope someday that I will be able to write full time, but not yet.
And I too have a full-time day job. I'm a legal editor and now a legal writer and analyst. Technically, I'm a journalist, which I just really love. I get to be an official enemy of the people. So I really enjoy my day job, but the writing is very different from what I do creatively, and it can be really hard to switch gears. And no, I have never made a living at it. I think we're being asked to wrap up.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
Everybody's got links on the website, right? The
Yes.
Rainbow Space Magic website for our books. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you, everybody.